So I told you that this function that we pass to the effect hook gets executed after each render. Now, there are situations where we don't want this default behavior. We want to have more control over when this function should be executed. So let's look at an example. We're going to add a new component to our project called product list. Now, in this component, we're going to declare a state variable for storing our products. I'm going to initialize this to an empty array. Now we get products and set products. Okay. Now, here we're going to use the effect hook to call the server to fetch the products. So we pass a function. We refer to this as a callback function because React is going to call this function back. Okay. Now, in this function, we're going to fetch the products from the server. But for now, we don't want to worry about that complexity. Instead, we want to do a console.log and say fetching products. So we fetch the product and then we set products to a new array. So here I'm going to pass an array with two strings. Let's say clothing and household. Now here we have a compilation error saying type string is not assignable to type never. The reason we see this error is because we initialized this constant with an empty array. So the TypeScript compiler doesn't know what kind of objects do we want to store in this array. Are we going to store strings, numbers, objects, or what? So here we need to specify the type of this constant in angle brackets. That is going to be a string array. Now the error goes away, okay? So we fetch the products and then we can render them down here in the JSX. But let's not worry about that part. Instead, let's go to our app component and add the product list component. So product list. Now, if you go back to the browser, you will see that our browser is going to be blown up. Look at all these errors we're getting. We ended up in an infinite loop. So to prevent our web server from being overloaded, I'm going to comment out this line. We can do this by selecting a line and pressing Command and slash on Mac or Control and slash on Windows. So now this line is not executed, okay? Now let's see why we ended up in an infinite loop. So back to our product list, you learn that this function or this effect that we pass here gets executed after each render. Now in this function, we're updating the state, which triggers another render. And that means our effect is going to be executed one more time. Now the next time this is executed, again, we're updating the state. So we end up in an infinite loop of updating state, re-rendering, and executing our effect. To solve this problem, we should tell React to run this effect only once the first time our component is rendered. So this effect hook has a second argument, which is optional. Here we pass an array of dependencies. In this array, we can add one or more variables, which can be props or state, and our effect will be dependent on these values. If any of these values changes, React will rerun our effect. But if we pass an empty array, that means this effect is not dependent on any values. So it will be executed only once. So to see this in action, let's go back to the app component and bring this back in. Now, here in the browser, let's refresh. We don't see those errors anymore, but we are fetching products twice. Can you tell why this is happening? We talked about this earlier in the course. This has to do with the strict mode. When the strict mode is on, React renders each component twice. And this happens only in the development mode. So it doesn't happen when we build our application for production. So because currently we are in the development mode, React renders each component twice, and that's why we're fetching the products twice. Now let's take this example to the next level. Let's say we want to add a drop-down list on the top for displaying categories. When the user selects a category, we want to show the products in that category. So back to the app component, we're going to add a select with the class of form-select above our product list. Now here we're going to add a few options. I'm going to add an empty option followed by a couple more. Let's say clothing and household. These are our categories. Now here we need to keep track of the selected category in a state variable. So when the state is changed, our product list is re-rendered. So here we use the state hook. We initialize this variable to an empty string and call it category. Okay, now we don't need the effect hook So delete. Next, we need to handle the change event of this select element. So on change, we set it to a function. In this function, we call setCategory, and to get the selected category, we add the event parameter, and here we pass event.target.value, right? Now to test our application. So back to the browser, here are our categories. If I change the category, the state is updated. To verify this, we can go to React DevTools in the Components tab. So look, here's our app component, and here we have a state set to clothing. If we change this to household, now the state is updated to household. Beautiful. Now we need to pass the selected category as a prop to the product list component. So back to the product list component. Here we should use an interface to define the shape of props. But let me show you a shortcut. We don't always have to explicitly use an interface. So look, previously we wrote code like this. Category props, right? Now, if our props is very simple, if we only have a single or a maximum of 2 props, we can declare them inline here. So instead of declaring an interface called props, we can add an object here and say in this object, we have a property called category of type string. This was the definition of our props interface, right? But now we added this inline right here, okay? So here we have the category. Now we can change the message we log on the console and say fetching products in this category. Now back to the app component, we have to pass the selected category to the product list component. So category equals category. Now let's test our application one more time. Initially, we get fetching products in with no category because no category is selected. Now let's select clothing. Nothing is happening. If we change the category to household, again, we are not fetching products in the new category. The reason this is happening is because of the empty array that we passed as a dependency to the effect hook. We told React that this effect is not dependent on any values, so React executed our effect only once. To solve the bug in our application, we have to tell React that this effect should be dependent on the category prop. So anytime the value of the category changes, React should re-execute this effect. So we add category here. And of course, in a more complex scenario, we could have more dependencies here. Anytime the value of any of these dependencies changes, React will rerun our effect, okay? Now back to the browser, refresh. Let's select clothing. Now we are fetching products in clothing. Let's change this to household. Now we are fetching products in the household category. Beautiful. So let's quickly recap. The second argument to the effect hook is the dependencies array. If we leave it out, React will execute our effect after every render. If we pass an empty array, React will execute our effect only once the first time our component is rendered. If we add one or more values here, which can be props or state variables, React will rerun our effect every time any of these values changes.